This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. It's hard getting your book published. It's even harder when you're an author of color. Between 1950 and 2018, 95% of American fiction books were written by white people. That's according to one analysis from the New York Times in 2020. Despite that, authors of color are working to get their stories told across genres. This hour, we're joined by two authors based in Connecticut to talk about their debut books, navigating the publishing industry, and the importance of centering marginalized voices. In her novel, The Girls in Queens, Christine Candic-Torres tells the story of two Latina women coming of age in Queens, New York. And in her memoir, A Body Across Two Hemispheres, Victoria Butron shares how she came of age between Ecuador and the United States. They're also both editors of the 2024 Connecticut Literary Anthology. Christine and Victoria, welcome to the show and thanks for being here today.
Hi, Catherine. Thank you so much for having us.
And for our listeners...
Hi, Catherine. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Of course, we're very joyful to have you both joining us for this conversation today. And just a quick reminder for our listeners, if you have any questions or if you're an aspiring author, let us know. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. And so before we hear more about both of your debut novels, I want to start with each of your personal journeys and experiences. And Christine, we're going to go with you first. How did you get started as a writer?
Well, I guess the boilerplate answer is that I've always been a writer, right? Like I've always been writing since I was a kid, in the background, sort of. It was never something that I honestly thought I could pursue as a career until I couldn't ignore the call to write. So I used to work at a religious nonprofit. And they offered sabbatical leave for clergy and lay people. And so I had already published a few short stories, but I decided to apply for sabbatical and use that to go to my first artist residency. And it was there that because I wanted to work on my craft on my own time and have it be paid for. That was great. And it was there at that residency where I met other working visual artists and writers, and I realized that you really could cobble together a life, like an artistic life. I did not go to art school. I don't have an MFA. I worked in advertising before that nonprofit, so it was very eye-opening experience for me. And so after that experience at the residency, I started working in earnest on this novel that ended up being published. And it was a long road to get there, which I think we can get into too. Like I met my agent at a writing conference. And the business side of it came when it came, but I think I worked more on building out my literary community. In New York at the time, I was living in Queens, and that really helped me just learn and connect and commiserate with other writers.
Well, it's nothing like a cobbled street, I think, this road to writing. It's always, I think, challenging, but also rewarding when you do find success from it. So I hope that resonates with writers, aspiring writers here in Connecticut. And Victoria, what did your path into writing look like? I think you got started by checking out writing workshops at libraries, right?
Yes. And before that, I was a translator. That's what I did my BA in. And I started that in Ecuador, actually. And I did take some creative writing courses when I was in college in Ecuador. And then when I transferred to Hunter College CUNY in the city. But when I was taking those courses, I never thought of myself as I'm going to have a career in writing. I'm going to be a published writer. It was just, this is fun. I've always liked to write, and maybe I can write something creative. And I got my BA in 2015. And then about a year or two later, this idea kept on popping up in my head, like, maybe I have a story here about my life, about my crazy life. And I want to explore that. And I was no longer going to Hunter College. And so I said, okay, what's the next best thing in libraries? I love libraries. So I started taking some workshops at my local library, from the Ferguson Library in Stamford, Connecticut, and also the Norwalk Public Library. And then eventually I took a workshop at the Westport Writers Workshop. And then after that, I really sat down with myself and I said, I want to write this book. What is the next step? And that's when I applied to an MFA program at Fairfield University. And I got in, and throughout those 2 years that I attended the MFA, I worked on my thesis, which eventually became A Body Across Two Hemispheres and was eventually published by a local Connecticut independent press.
Well, I find it really fascinating that both of you sort of have this very similar cobbling experience and not expecting that something that you are passionate and something you did for fun that can turn into a career, which I think is very inspiring. And we love libraries here in this space as well. And Christine, your debut work is a novel called The Girls in Queens. And so without spoiling too much, can you tell us what it's about?
Sure. The Girls in Queens is a story about the fierce loyalty and friendship between two young Latina Mets fans named Brisma and Kelly, which is challenged when Brisma's ex-boyfriend Brian is accused of sexual assault. So at first, the girls rush to his defense and stand by him. But as Brisma begins to question her own relationships with men, she begins to have second thoughts and Kelly remains by his side. And each of the girls are forced to determine not only what justice means to each of them, but who deserves it.
And can you tell us, who are the girls in Queens?
Um, who are the girls in Queens? And at large, I'm writing for the girls in Queens, right?
Mm-hmm.
I was a girl in Queens. I'm Puerto Rican and Croatian. Queens is one of the boroughs of New York City, and it is, I think, the most diverse county in the United States. All the friends I had growing up were from, if they were not immigrants themselves from other countries, their parents were. We were exposed to so many different cultures very organically, and there's a lot of sort of cross-pollination of that. And I think in that, in being that sort of in between, having that in between experience of feeling very close or wanting to feel very close to your family's country of origin, and yet being rooted in New York or in America, it created this fierce love and loyalty to Queens too. So like Queens became our homeland in a way. And so I really wanted to write a love letter to kids that feel that way, to people that have grown up with that experience.
Well, and Victoria, I think you wrote a similar but different, if that makes sense, kind of in between experience in your memoir, A Body Across Two Hemispheres, where you share about going back and forth between Ecuador and the US. And you do pull at so many different threads from that experience, learning two languages, two cultures, searching for a place to call home. So, what else should listeners know about your work? What would you like to share with them?
Sure. And before I answer your question, I did want to comment on something
Yeah,
that you
go for
said
it.
earlier about both Christine and I's path to publication. And I can't speak for Christine, but in my point of view, I would say that when I was growing up, because I did not see myself reflected in the publishing industry, and
Hmm.
because, as you stated earlier, from the 1950s to 2018, 95% of novels were published by white writers. So I didn't see myself as, oh, I can become this, because it just wasn't something that I saw around me.
Right.
But to answer your last question, my memoir is a memoir and essays. So it's not your typical memoir that it starts out with chapter one, chapter two, and it continues in chronological order. Because my life feels so fragmented, and because I lived between Ecuador in the United States. I moved to the United States when I was 5, and then I moved back to Ecuador when I was 15, and then I moved back to Connecticut when I was 22. Because of that, I had to make it into a memoir and essays, and it's really divided by location instead of by time frame because of that.
Well, and
So in
actually,
a way, it reflects my life.
right. No, absolutely. I think it's with especially with both of your novels and your experiences, I think location plays a really big role. And I want to come back to Victoria, you sort of traveling between two worlds. But Christine, you mentioned earlier, born and raised in Queens, New York, but now living in CT or in Connecticut. I'm from LA. We love our acronyms. Sometimes I can't get it out of my system. But how has that experience influenced you and your work? Because it may, it's close. They're two close locations, but very different worlds.
Oh yeah, they are. And I have never lived outside of New York City until moving. I live in Fairfield now, and so it is certainly very different. But I think that it was a necessary move for me as a human being, an individual, and also as an artist. I think it's allowed some maybe more softness in.
Mm.
I some to really dig deep for even more empathy. So I
Sure.
talk a lot about how I grew up with so many different kinds of people, but I've never grown up or I've never lived in a place that was close to 90% white.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is a totally different experience, and requires me to sort of stretch that divide a little bit more and consider other points of view that I didn't necessarily get exposed to
Right.
in the city, and that definitely filters into my work too.
I find that so fascinating because I've heard from a lot of friends who have lived abroad or across the country here in the U.S. And it's so fascinating because oftentimes I'll hear they actually experience culture shock more in between states versus in between countries. But Victoria, you're writing about in between
Mhm.
countries, so we'd love to hear about your experience in terms of traversing between two worlds, which I think to a certain extent might be more than just two, right? So how has that shaped how you think about place, and location, both just as a human being and as a writer?
Oh, wow.
I know it's a
What a
big question.
question. Oh my goodness. That's a huge question. I feel like I should write a book about that entire question. But I think that place has molded me in so many different ways that I'm very conscious of, and ways that I'm not really, that's very unconscious in a
Mm,
way. And I haven't been to the country I was born in since 2018.
mm,
Been 6 years. And the last time I tried to go, the pandemic was going on, so I had to cancel my flight. And so I think about that because what happens when you have a certain distance from the place that you grew up in or that you were born in? And how does that also change your life and change the way you view things? I think Christine right now just said, okay, I moved from from one state to another, and we're neighboring states, and there's already such a big difference in demographics. And I think that's the thing about location. You're not just changing locations, you're changing who you see every day, what conversations you have, and what the issues are in that particular place. So I have seen my actual home as my body.
mm.
I feel like in the last few years, like that will forever be my home. And I will transverse different locations throughout my life, and they will become part of who I am as time goes on.
Mm,
Well, actually, Christine, I want to ask,
that's beautiful.
right, based based on what Victoria just shared, with the theme of particular places and particular issues, and because you get into a very specific theme of female friendship and girlhood that's very much related to the location that you're writing from, and it also feels very much like a coming of age story. So, Why was it important for you to bring that into your work?
Um, well, I mentioned that they're Mets fans and baseball plays a part in the story. So,
Right?
um, I don't know how familiar you are with baseball or the New York Mets specifically, but they are usually underdogs.
Mhm.
Okay, they don't
Mhm.
usually get very far. And I wove them into the story of these girls. First of all, I wanted girls to be sports fans and not have it necessarily tied to men. And so I was very happy to do that. Um, but I worked in the Mets because they are such underdogs, because they are usually counted out, and it's set over three different years. The timelines alternate, and so the primary story is happening in 2006, which was a year that the Mets got very close to winning it all, but then didn't. And I wanted you to root for the girls too. So I wanted you to feel that anticipation, that feeling of like maybe it's our time. That in 2006, the Mets was helmed by a Dominican American manager who grew up in Queens in the neighborhoods that I had grown up in, and he was very intentional in building a Latino heavy team, and so it felt very I personally have nostalgia for that time, how it felt to see people that looked like us on the main stage, and they were catering to people like us in the audience, teaching Spanish during the games. So I wanted to capture that essence of Queens, of these marginalized girls, marginalized by race, class, ethnicity, and their experiences, who are being denied their experiences, their violations, assaults, to feel like maybe we can, maybe this is our time to stand up for ourselves. Maybe this is time to reevaluate what we've been taught. Maybe this is time to step into our power. Um,
Well, because you
so
mentioned
that's one way in which
right,
Queens helped. Mhm.
right, and I know there are multiple ways that you're doing that with your novel, and because you mentioned marginalized voices, and there are so many different kinds of voices within that, I think umbrella. Victoria, I wanted to ask, because both of your books hit home on the importance of centering those voices in literature, not just characters in the books, but also the people who wrote those books. So, how do you think about this today? Are we seeing more centering of these voices from both characters and from the perspective of the writers?
You know, I think that in the last few years, especially since 2020, there have been a lot of organizations and a lot of people trying to uplift more marginalized voices and people of color. But I don't think that we'll see until a few years whether or not those efforts have really shifted the publishing industry. I would say that it's hard to determine that after a few years. But for me, it is important to uplift voices. And I think that one of the ways, and I know we'll be talking about this further on, but the Connecticut Literary Anthology.
Right.
And I was very grateful when Woodhull Press reached out to me back in 2022 and asked me to oversee the 2023 Connecticut Literary Anthology. And that was an amazing opportunity. I worked with Connecticut writers. And then when they asked me to come and reprise the role, I said yes. And I also said, I have an idea. Why don't we also bring on people who are part of the 2023 CT Lit Anthology and have them be genre editors? And I recommended Christine, and I also recommended Summer Tate. And I think that that is a way that we can shift this publishing industry just in our own little corner, in our own little ways. How do we make that change ourselves instead of waiting for someone else to do it?
Right. Because sometimes the changes happen in the
Yeah, if
small
I could
steps,
hop
right?
on
Yeah,
to that.
absolutely. Christine, take us home.
Um, I also want to say that I do think there has been a shift in more stories that are centering marginalized voices, that the more diverse authors are getting deals, books are coming out. I'm so thrilled to see so many friends of mine come out with their books, but that's only a part of the story too, right? There are book deals, but then we need to have the marketing behind them. We need to have publicity. We need to have like true belief behind these stories to uplift them. And so until we all get that, I think Victoria's exactly right that we have to help lift up our peers too, in all of the opportunities that we get.
And we'll be continuing this conversation talking about the publishing industry and both Christine and Victoria's debut novels. After a quick break, coming up, we will talk more about their experiences as debut authors. And listeners, let us know if you have any questions about writing or publishing. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Hope you've got room for 2 more books on your summer reading lists. Today, we're hearing from 2 Connecticut-based authors about their debut works. Christine Candick Torres is the author of the novel The Girls in Queens, and Victoria Butron is the author of the memoir A Body Across 2 Hemispheres. And let us know if you have any questions. Join the conversation. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Christine, both of you have picked out an excerpt from your novels, and Christine, you for The Girls in Queens. So before you read that portion, can you set it up for our listeners? What are we expecting here?
Sure. So the excerpt that I'm going to read is from the middle of the book, but I think we're clear on spoilers. Brisma, the main character, has gone to another girl's home in the suburbs, and this girl has recently come forward with a claim of sexual assault. And while Brisma's there, she's being exposed, or she's learning about her life. Her name is Janet, and how she was brought up in a different way. She's comparing the ways in which she was brought up differently than Brisma.
All right, go for it.
Thanks. Okay. Your parents still together? I asked. Of course they are, I thought. What a stupid question. Yeah, she said, frowning slightly, scooping her own glass up and onto a coaster beside one of the peach armchairs. Why do you ask? Oh, I said, clearing my throat as I sat down in the chair opposite her. It's just kind of rare, don't you think? Don't know if I know anyone whose parents aren't split up. Janet raised her eyebrows. Guess I'm lucky. I stared at the plush pink carpet beneath my feet and thought about how nice it must feel to sink your bare toes into the soft fibers. I wondered how lucky Janet had felt in her hospital gown, the fluorescent spotlight cutting through the bile of an encroaching hangover. I thought of the open smiles in that photo on the lake, and the lines in Griselda's sour face, and the gravel scrape of Francis's taunting laugh, and the towel Mommy clutched to her chest that cold night with El Cochino. And I wondered where in this house Janet had developed the tools to make the leap from yes to no to help. Security, the report said she'd yelled. How different that word must feel in her mouth than in mine, in Kelly's. This anger, though old and constant, would get me nowhere. I looked at Janet nervously looping her hair behind her ear, and then in front of it again. We were both just girls, and at that moment, in that house, regardless of the forms and functions of the families and neighborhoods we came from, we needed each other.
Well, thank you so much, Christine, for sharing that portion with us. And Victoria, you also picked out an essay from your memoir, A Body Across 2 Hemispheres, and it's called But Where Are You Really From? What should our listeners know about what they're about to hear here?
Sure. So this is a 100-word essay. So I try to challenge myself with that constraint. And you will hear in 2 sections where the word blank is used. And that's because there's going to be a space there for the reader to fill in however they see fit.
Gotcha.
So this is called, But Where Are You Really From? What I want to say, From the syntax of Spanglish sentences, the tilde, umlaut, diéresis, the strips of sapote I devoured yesterday, still stuck between my teeth, irking my gums. My father's latent rage. Nowhere. From whichever sound lava makes when it froths into the ocean. Larkspur. The brown of overripe pineapples. My ancestors. The collision of comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 with Jupiter. An incessant twitch on the left eyelid. Plantains. Definitely plantains. A tongue touching the hard palate when emphasizing a double R. What I answer. I was born in blank, but I've lived in blank most of my life. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria, for sharing that essay with us. It was very, I think, powerful to hear verbally on the air. And we'd love to get an idea of how both of you sort of, what are your writing processes like? Christine, where do you start when you've gotten an idea for a book? Do you do an outline, start with characters, or none of the above?
I think it changes from project to project for me. With the Girls and Queens, I started with scenes. There were scenes I wanted to write. I knew a scene that was going to come at the beginning and a scene that was going to come at the end. And there was a girl character in them. And then I started building out who she was. So I think for sure the process is rooted in character. I'm writing a new book now, and a character has come to me very strong and fast. So I'm trying to capture that voice and write that.
And Victoria, what about you? Is your writing process similar or differences, especially with different genres, maybe?
Yeah, it's a little bit different. I do connect with Christine when you mentioned a character comes to you fast or something comes to you fast, because at times that does happen, but it doesn't happen all the time. And I wish it did, right? Our lives would be so much easier if it just came fast whenever we wanted it to.
Yeah.
But no, it doesn't happen all the time. So my first step, and actually regardless of what genre I'm writing, is that I would say usually 100% of the time I write by hand. Not a lot of people do that, but that's very important for me because it allows me not to edit while I write. It just allows me to write. I don't have to think about, well, I'm going to go back. And when I'm on a computer, I have this urge to go back. I have this urge to do the backspace, delete. I can go to the previous paragraph and it's a lot easier to change things around. But when it's the first draft and when it's by hand, I just have to continue. And so that is the first step. Then I transfer it to the computer. And then it really depends. Sometimes I edit it a few more times and I feel like it's ready. Sometimes it takes months to get a piece polished, or a short story or a flash piece polished. And right now I'm currently working on a poetry book. So it's very different from a memoir. And I feel like the process is very different there. Before, I'd be a night owl. That's what I used to be when I wrote A Body Across Two Hemispheres. And now I wake up really early because I guess that's my poetry brain. And that's where it's like, okay, well, we can only do poetry in the mornings. A memoir is a night thing. I don't know. So I think that every single person just has to try out different methods and see what works for them. And like Christine said, sometimes it depends on the project. Sometimes you get into the flow with a specific process for one project, and then you start a new one, and then the flow is different. So every book is a beast, right, Christine? It's a different beast. And at the same time, you evolve and you change, and your methods also change.
Totally. I also outlined the Girls and Queens on index cards, color coded. There are 3 different timelines, and so that really helped me. And I tried to do the same for the book I'm writing now, and I was like, no. Like, I got maybe the first 3 chapters in, and I was like, no, I just need to write what's coming. Like, wherever this happens in the story, I'm just going to write it, and we'll make sense of this later. But I will say I do also write by hand. I wrote the first draft by hand. I mean, in pieces, right? For the Girls and Queens, and I'm doing the same now. And I find the transcription from notebook to computer is a crucial part of the creation. Actually, it helps me to be physically touching a notebook and a pen. I am physically creating something, tricking my brain maybe, and then that transferring it, I my that part of my brain is sort of shut off and another part is open. This might sound very woo woo, but like as I'm typing it in, I'm sort of like open to receiving the changes, the edits that need to be made, or like, oh, this would work well here. And so it is like a sacred part of my process too, to transcribe it into the computer.
Yeah.
I think
I
there is
call it,
something to be said about that. Go for it, Victoria.
yeah. I call the sitting down and writing your first draft your writing brain, and then
Mhm.
transferring it to the computer your editing brain. So
Totally.
it's definitely, I completely agree with you. Some people might call it woo woo. You can just call it, this is my writing brain, this is my editing brain, and that doesn't sound as woo woo. But I love it. I do understand the woo woo part because it's like you said, tricking your brain into getting into this other type of role
Mhm.
as an editor.
Well, I,
Yeah.
I actually I really love that because in my career I was 98% of the time I was a newspaper reporter, and the entire time I've used a notepad and a pen slash pencil, and it was the only way I knew how to report. I couldn't fathom the idea of lugging around a laptop, and I didn't really trust a recorder, and that sounds hilarious. But I also didn't have time to go back and listen to the audio to transcribe into your my deadline. And so it's
Mhm.
always paper and pen. So this makes me feel a little bit better about myself. I
Yeah.
didn't really use much technology actually until I became a radio reporter. So I don't know what that means. I know there's a lot of neuroscientists out there that can probably explain how this whole processes work. So we'll do a follow-up conversation about that for for our next conversation. And Victoria, I'm going to start with you first here. I always love hearing from authors and writers about where they draw inspiration from, and also your influences. So who are some of your biggest influences as a writer, or maybe even as a reader?
Oh, I love that question. And I think that my influences have shifted over time. When I was a young girl growing up in Connecticut, I didn't really see a lot of Latino American writers.
Mm.
And the ones that I had access to, I loved them. And it was like Esmeralda Santiago and Sandra Cisneros with The House on Mango Street.
Right.
And maybe I read when I was Puerto Rican that book way too early. I think I need to reread it again now that I'm in my 30s, and I probably shouldn't have read it as early as I did. But that's what I had and that's what I loved. And now that I'm older, that I, consider myself a writer, I also have inspiration from contemporary writers, Latinas like Hakira Diaz and Miriam Gurba, and also other feminist writers like Rebecca Solnit. Those are the people that influence me. Those are the people that I feel like speak truth to power, and they inspire me a lot.
What about you, Christine? Influences that you've
Um,
had?
Esmeralda Santiago, I loved. I would recommend America's Dream is a novel that she wrote, and it is set between Vieques, Puerto Rico, and um, New York, but I think it might be Connecticut. Like it's a suburban town. I think it's Connecticut. And it's about a mother and a daughter and an abusive situation. I think it speaks to a lot of the themes that I like to write about and to read about. And I love Esmeralda Santiago. Julia Alvarez was a huge
Mm.
influence on me. In the Time of the Butterflies, it's a book that I read. It might be the first book I read by a Latina. Um, and I don't know if that was in high school or in middle school. Despite growing up in the most diverse county of the United States, it took a while to reach me. Um, and of course, Toni Morrison. For the Girls and Queens, though, I would have to say that Elena Ferrante and
Mm.
her Neapolitan novels was a huge influence on me coming up with the idea for this book. I loved the female friendship, the how it was portrayed without too much sweetness, let's say, like that
Sure.
there are rough parts. And it captured the rough working class neighborhoods that they were in and how that changed over their lives. So yeah, Elena Ferrante was also a big influence on this book.
And I also want to ask both of you this question about audience, because I think most of the titles and authors that we've been talking about this hour, really it's for a very broad audience, but sometimes it can be sort of accidentally limited, I think, just based on race and history and background. So I'm curious to hear who do you write for? Who do you think your audiences are? Christine, let's start with you.
All right, so let's start. I'll start by saying that I agree with you that I do think in being so specific in my novel, it becomes universal, right? That's a maxim. And I think that everybody will be able to relate to some aspect of it. And in particular, I've had like cishet men come up to me after reading it and being like, oh, I've been in a situation like this. I've said things like this, and I'm reevaluating my roles in situations. And that's been really interesting. But like I said earlier, even my publisher asked me, who are you writing for? Who's your audience? And it's very specifically Queens, Latinas,
Right.
to the point that when I received my early copies of my novel, I looked through my old paperwork because I wanted to send it to, I wanted to send copies to people. And I found information on a 10th grade English teacher of mine. I found an essay I'd written in his class. It was about where do you want to be in 5 years? And I had written then at 15 that I want to be writing stories for other 15-year-old Latinas in Queens so that they don't feel so alone. That is truly what I wrote at 15. And now I've reconnected with him, and I've gone back to my high school to run workshops and talk with students. And so yeah, in that way, it's very specific,
Right.
very limited, but it's very fulfilling that been able to do this full circle. And I know that it has helped other people.
Right.
It
Right.
has reached other people as well.
Right. And I mean that's a beautiful connection, I think. And Victoria, same question to you, who do you write for?
If I'm speaking from my ego, I would say everyone,
Mm.
right? But honestly, the first person that I write for is myself. It was something that I enjoyed when I didn't think of myself as, oh, I'm going to make a career in this. It was just, I write for fun, I write for me. So I always say the first draft is for me because I don't even know if that first draft will become something that I want to share with the world. So that is definitely for me. But then when it comes to a body across two hemispheres, who did I write that for? I wrote that primarily for me when I was 15 because I moved to Ecuador when I was 15 after living in Norwalk, Connecticut and Stamford, Connecticut for the better part of 10 years. So that was primarily for me. But also, when I grew up in Connecticut during that time, I did not see any Ecuadorian American writers on the shelves of the public libraries that I visited. So today, when I have people reach out to me through Instagram or through email and they say, I'm Ecuadorian, this might have been the first time that I saw a woman who's Ecuadorian American in a memoir, and I just want to thank you for that. And that is why I write for people that might not have seen themselves in the library when they were 15. And for me.
Right. Absolutely. And that's very important, I think, for a writer and a reader in this process. And well, thank you so much for sharing those stories with us. And for our listeners, stick with us. We'll hear more from Christine and Victoria about navigating the publishing industry coming up. And let us know if you have any questions about writing or publishing. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. All hour, we've been joined by two Connecticut authors. Christine Candic-Torres is the author of the novel The Girls in Queens, and Victoria Butron is the author of the memoir A Body Across Two Hemispheres. We've been talking about their debut books, how they approach writing, and so much more. But writing is really only just one part of the journey in getting a book in print. So we're going to get into talking a little bit about the publishing industry and the business aspects of it. And of course, I want to ask both of you, Christine and Victoria, this question. We're going to start with Christine. Both of you are debut authors. It's really hard to get a book published when you're not established. And Christine, earlier you talked about a sort of a list of things that you have to do to get noticed. So talk about, how did you get your book noticed?
Yeah, it's a very difficult road. So I was at a Quayle International Literary Festival. Quayle is a journal that publishes exclusively writers of color, and they also hold 2 conferences every year. And so at one of those conferences, I did one of these sort of like speed dating pitch sessions with agents.
Right.
And so that's where I did initially meet my agent. And I will say that I was encouraged to do it by the editor of Quayle, Laura Pegram. She believed in my work. I was not finished writing the manuscript. So that was a little intimidating, but I still talked about it and I pitched it with the agent, and she was interested. She wanted to read it. And so she was cool with waiting for a while for whenever it was ready, which is maybe unusual, but she was. And so I was grateful for that. When I sent it to her, it was rejected at first. And in the meantime, please know I'm also sending out tons of query letters, which is emails that you send, sort of like cold calling other agents.
Right.
And when it was rejected, she also sent me really great specific feedback on the manuscript about how she thinks it could be improved. And so because she did that, which is unusual to get also, I responded and asked if she would be willing to read a revised version. And she said yes. And so I did. I took her feedback into account. I revised the manuscript and I sent it back to her. All told, in the meantime, while reaching out to other agents, I maybe racked up 45 to 50 rejections. So rejection is the name of the game. Like it is when you're trying to publish short stories or poetry, like you just have to be comfortable with rejection. Right. I eventually did sign with that agent, and then we embarked on the next round of getting used to rejection by going out on submission, trying to reach out to editors. But I will say, when I did finally connect with my editor, it was wonderful. Like it felt so different. It was like, oh, like a welcoming home. Like, oh, this is the person that is going to help shepherd this book out. She connected with it right away, and I felt all in all very grateful that both my agent and editor are women of color. I think that helped in the process of them looking out for me and maintaining, the integrity of my voice and my vision.
And Victoria, earlier we talked a little bit about some challenges facing authors of color. Can you talk more about that, expound more, and maybe from your perspective, how can the publishing world do better?
Sure. So my trajectory is very different because I think that memoir and publishing memoir is very different as well. And so I completed my thesis, which was this book. And actually, let me backtrack. I didn't complete the entire book, but the thesis requirements I did. And Fairfield University, where I completed my MFA, they have something every 2 years called the Fairfield Book Prize. And I did not want to submit my book because the 5 winners before me had all been novels, and my book is a memoir. But a friend in the program pushed me to send it out, and then it won the 2021 Connecticut the Fairfield Book Prize. And so that is how I became acquainted with Woodhull Press, and they eventually published the book in 2022. And that is very different from, like I said, novel publishing and the trajectory that Christine had. So I did not have an agent. I sent it out to a contest and it won. So it's very different. And I think there's a lot of avenues to publishing. And I think that if you were to speak with 8 different published authors, they would all give you 8 different ways to go to publishing. But they will all agree that it's a very long road, that it's very difficult, and that you have to keep on trying, and that rejection will be there. Rejection is part of the game. and rejection should not stop you. And if I tie that in to the Connecticut Literary Anthology, that book is possible because the Hartford Foundation, an anonymous donor, was able to provide the funds in order for the 2023 and then now the 2024 literary anthology to be published.
Well, that's a great transition because I did want to ask you more about the anthology. We've got a few minutes left, but I still want to touch on it a little bit because the anthology features writers from all over Connecticut, and you've edited in the past and are focused on nonfiction this year. So can you talk a little bit about what goes into selecting writers to feature in the anthology?
Yes, so there is always a submissions period where anyone from Connecticut can submit their work, and they can submit in the fiction genre, nonfiction, and poetry. And so we have a time frame for that, a few months, and then Woodhull Press, the editors, the interns, and also the genre editors, we read the pieces, and then we decide what makes it into the published anthology. But it's very tough. There's a lot of talent, and it's just a beautiful process. And we do have events throughout Connecticut, both in Hartford and Fairfield County and online. So we did that last year, and then the 2024 version will be published in October.
So we got about 30 seconds here, Christine, but you're editing the fiction side of this year's anthology. Can you talk about, what do you look for when you're putting that together?
I look for a genuine human connection. In short fiction, you need to, I think, capture a unique moment in time, an epiphany. But I was so thrilled that in the 2024 edition, we were able to encompass a range of genres. So we have speculative, we have a beautiful meditation on grief, and some great urban stories about, like what we've been talking about, centering marginalized voices in communities like Bridgeport and Fairhaven.
Well, thank you so much for that. We got about 30 seconds, I think, for both of you. Actually, just one final question. What brings you back to the page really quickly, Victoria?
What brings me back? Oh, gosh. I always have questions for myself, and I need to figure them out in writing. And I feel like something's there. I want to share it with others as well.
Perfect. Christine, 15 seconds.
Anxiety.
As I'm feeling...
I feel like I need to. Yeah, I need to write.
That's
and it
great.
helps with my anxiety. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much. Nothing like anxiety to encourage us to end the show now, actually, with a couple seconds left. But I want to give a huge thanks to Christine Candic-Torres and Victoria Butron for joining us this hour. And we'll link to both of their books on our website, ctpublic.org/wherewelive. Thank you so much, Christine and Victoria, for being with us today.
Thank you. This was a thrill.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And just FYI for listeners that the 2024 Connecticut Literary Anthology that they edited will be published in October, and you can attend the publication's launch event at the Mark Twain House in Hartford on October 20th. And for more information on that, visit woodhallpress.com. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Meg Dalton. Our technical producer is Bradley O'Connor. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you so much for listening. Happy reading and happy writing.